Everybody. So good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here. So pleased that Kappa asked me to come and lead this discussion. And really, I won't be doing a lot of the talking. I'm hoping that you will. I'm going to show you all a short video. It's about 20 minutes long, but it is a colleague of mine. Actually, I consider her more of a mentor. Her name is Dr. Kamara P. Jones. And Dr. Jones has done over the past uh, over a couple of decades, over 2 decades, has been really looking at structural racism and how that contributes to health disparities and health inequities. And she is a master at allegories. She really caught all of our attention when she came up with the Gardener's Tale, which is an allegory to describe the three levels of racism. And I won't give it away. I'll let her talk about it. But she began to build from that and began to build a three-dimensional model of looking at not just not just looking at health disparities, but looking at health inequities, looking at social and structural issues as they relate to health disparities and inequities. And so what we want to do is show you all the video, and then we will break you up into semi-small groups, maybe 6 to 7 people in each group. And we'll put in the chat a few prompt questions for you all to talk about. But really, that is just to prompt you. We want you to have a discussion. And then the last few minutes, we'll bring everybody back. And what I would ask you to do when we put you in your breakouts is to identify one person to sort of be your scribe or your person that will report back to the large group things that you talked about and learned as a result of the discussion. All right. Okay. So with that being said, I am going to share screen and start the video. Let's see. Now, can you all hear? Did you all hear that okay?
Yes, we can hear that.
Excellent.
Hello, everybody. Wow, the people up in the balcony, too. I am delighted to be here today. You've heard that I'm in health, and a lot of my work is on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. But what I'm going to do today is empower all of us with tools for communicating about race and racism. I see the world in allegories. Sometimes I just look at an ordinary situation and I get some insight about how to communicate about very complex ideas. So today I'm going to share with you 4 allegories on race and racism that I hope you will understand, remember, and then pass them on. The first story, Japanese Lanterns, Colored Perceptions, was sparked by my own real experience back in the day when I was at this very nice garden party in the evening in California. And I had my turn with chitting and chatting, and I was just sort of tired, and I wanted to just sit back in the corner of the garden and relax and listen to the conversation and music just wash over me. And as I sat there in the garden, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths. And then I looked a little further on and I saw a group of green moths and a group of blue moths. And so not only was I fascinated by that, I was fascinated by how they naturally were sorting according to their kind. And then I looked over my shoulder and I saw, wow, and there's some yellow moths and some purple moths and some orange moths too. And the scientist in me was getting very excited about this until I was like, oh, of course. There is no such thing as purple or pink or blue or green or yellow or orange moths. Moths are different colors, yes, but they're different colors of brown and tan and speckled and splotched. But the colors that I thought I was seeing and the colors that we think we see every day are actually due to the lights by which we look. These colored lights distort and mask our own true variability, which can only be seen under a universal light that allows all possibility. So when I remembered this image, I started thinking, what is race? And how do the racial categories that we construct color our imaginations of who we are. And in my mind, race is clearly a social classification, not a biological descriptor. It is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. So here in Atlanta, in the United States, by the colored lights that we look at, I'm clearly black. But in some parts of Brazil, with different colored lights, I'm clearly colored. Clearly white, actually. And in South Africa, I'm clearly colored. And so we need to challenge ourselves to understand the impact of these different colored racial categories that we construct and how it's limiting our understanding of our own true variability. The second story, Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This was also from my time back as a medical student in California. And I had been studying with some friends. It was getting late. We'd missed dinner. And so we went into town to get something to eat. And we walk into a restaurant, and we sit down, we order our food. Our food is served, and here we are eating. And that's not remarkable. Many of you have had that experience. And I wouldn't have thought anything more about it or be talking about it today, except that I looked up and I noticed a sign. And that sign was provided me a profound insight about racism. So what did the sign say? The sign said open. Now, you know, I could have thought nothing more about that, right? I was sitting at the table of opportunity eating with a sign that proclaimed open to me. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that in fact, people who were hungry but just a few feet away from me on the other side of the sign would not be able to come in because in fact now the restaurant was closed due to the hour. And I realized that racism and other systems of inequity structure open-closed signs in our society. And it's important for us to know something about the two-sided nature of these signs. It's important for us to understand how these signs, how racism and all of the other isms create a dual reality, where on one side, people who are in the side, for any of us, it's difficult for us to recognize any system of inequity that is privileging us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the world context. Yet, for those on the other side of the sign, they are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign, because it's proclaiming close to them, and yet they can see through the window and see that people are eating on the other side. So back inside the restaurant, I understand that people might ask, does racism really exist? Is there really a two-sided sign? Because in fact, it's hard to know when all you ever see is open. It's a privilege, in fact, not to have to know about the two-sided nature of the sign. But once you do know,
so I emailed Chris.
you don't
Said,
have
my
to
guess
act,
is
you
she's
can
been
choose to
moving,
act. And
so
the
then I
knowledge
jumped in
about
here. So I
racism and its
apologize.
continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation is actually empowering. The third of my, let me just, before I get off of that, now provide you with a definition of racism that evolves out of this understanding. And I'm really clear that racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. But it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is that opportunity structured? And on what basis is that value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race. And what are the impacts of this system of power? Well, it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, but it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that it's also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And then even as it's unfairly disadvantaging or advantaging individuals and communities, this system is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. My third story, Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, comes from my experience when my husband and I, newlywed, bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all along the porch. Now, When we went to plant our marigold seeds, we saw some of the boxes had dirt in them and some of the boxes were empty. So my husband dutifully goes to the gardening store and he's hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes and we put equal numbers of seeds in all of the boxes. And we water all of the boxes. And I'm not the gardener, so I sit back, just going to enjoy. And 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door and I stopped in my tracks, because it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some of the boxes versus others. In some of the boxes, they were full of plants, tall and vigorous looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them and they were scrawny and scraggly. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil was rich, fertile soil, so that in the potting soil, every single seed had sprouted, with the strong seed growing very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed making it to a middling height. But in that old soil, that poor rocky soil that we had found there, the weak seed had died. And even the strong seed had to struggle to make it halfway up. And if you guys garden, well, maybe you've composted half of your garden and you've seen the same thing. This image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. And I'm going to make it a story about racism. But before I do that, I want to talk to you just a little bit more about racism, because in the story, I'm going to illustrate 3 different levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And so, you know, sometimes I have an hour to talk about these things. I don't today, but I'm just going to quickly define each of them, make some important points, and then share the story. Institutionalized racism, what is it? It is that system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and our norms, and actually often shows up as inherited disadvantage. These are some examples of how it can impact you. Sometimes people look at my top bullet of housing, education, employment, and wealth, and they ask, isn't that social class? Why do you have this on a slide about racism? To which I respond, it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. But for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, for example, it was the taking of the land and the genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to the reservations. For people of African descent, it was the kidnapping of West African people, and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people stop me there and they say, well, you know what, Dr. Jones, you're talking about slavery. But the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and that's fully 149 years ago now. So all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as contemporary, present-day structural factors that are perpetuating the initial historical insult. And so when people ask me, am I talking about racism or social class, I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. Before I get off of this, I need to also say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, and often shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So here now we're talking about what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice and the discrimination, lots of ways that it can impact your health and your whole well-being. And like institutionalized racism, it can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, but even more important, it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You don't have to intend it to have a racist impact, to do something racist to have a racist impact. Third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Lots of ways that it can affect us, and it's really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So now, with this background about what I describe as these 3 levels of racism, let's go back to the story. So here I have now 2 flower boxes. But what we're going to introduce is a gardener. A gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the flowers are going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the flowers are going to produce red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and she takes the pink seed and she throws it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she sees in her garden what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the seed is sprouted. The strong seed has grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak red seed has made it to a middling height. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And here comes the strong pink seed, just trying to make it halfway up. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And then year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there for a minute to say that this first part of the story tells us something about institutionalized racism, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But okay, well, let's pick the story back up. Where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, now the gardener is looking at red, thinking that red is mighty beautiful. She looks over the pink flowers and she says, oh, they sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she sees that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that still goes on. And where is internalized racism in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, and then up to another pink flower, bzzz, and then it comes toward this other pink flower, and that pink flower says, get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, let's start with addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, right? And that's an important intervention. That's an important intervention, but as you can see, even if you do that, that's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. Or maybe you say, okay, let's deal with the personally mediated racism. So let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't, right? But even if she does, it still won't change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in the garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep separate boxes too, that's all right too, but if we do, it means that we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich, fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious as the red. And in that intervention, we might also address the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we also might address the personally mediated. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So, in this story, I've actually illustrated these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and very strongly suggested that if we want to set things right, we have to address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time. But the most important question is one that I haven't raised yet, and that is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Well, who is the gardener? The gardener clearly includes government, as well as media, as well as foundations and corporations, and even communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink, right? And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, because she's not even really keeping the pink flowers as part of her garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Lots of different questions that can come out of this story. But I'm going to close in this last minute with one last image. And this image is not from my own real experience, but actually this is an image taken from the book by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And in that image, she presents racism as a conveyor belt on which people are just living their ordinary lives, not really understanding that they're moving to and through racism, but just living their ordinary lives and contributing to racism by their benign inaction. So I'm going to build on this story, get back on the conveyor belt over here, to help us know how can we act. So here we are on this crowded conveyor belt, and we're just living our lives, most of us not even paying attention or even wondering where we're going. But say one of us looks up and we see racism. Well, one reaction is to close your eyes. That's denial, right? Or another reaction is to turn around. You're still going in the same direction. Maybe you're colorblind. But if we do not, and you know what that shows you? That shows you that racism is most often passive. Most often shows up as inaction in the face of need. But if we're on this conveyor belt and we don't want to go there, then what we have to do is start walking backwards, right? And we need to walk at least as fast as it's going, not to go that way, but now we have to start walking faster if we don't want to. We really want to get away from that. And what happens when you start walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You bump into people and they say, hey buddy, watch out. Where are you going? And this is your opportunity to do the first of 3 steps in terms of being actively anti-racist, and that is to name racism. You say, look, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? And most people will say, just stop bothering me. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn around with you. So now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards on this conveyor belt. And now where are you headed? You're not just going away from racism, but now you're actually going to understand the conveyor belt motor. And now you're going to do the second of the 3 stages of anti-racism, which is to ask, how is racism operating here? And so maybe one of you thinks it's a lever, and you pick the lever up, and the belt jolts because the lever is part of it. But it's a very smart conveyor belt, so whoop, it reconfigures itself and keeps going. So now you have to do the third thing to be actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act with others who are on the other side, trying this dial or trying this button. And I believe that we together can dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all of us can know our full potential and have the opportunity to develop to our full potential. So I have shared with you 4 allegories. Japanese lanterns talks about race as a social construct. Dual reality illustrates racism as a system that creates a 2-sided sign, a dual reality. Levels of racism illustrates 3 levels of racism and highlights the fact that if we want to set things right, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And life on a conveyor belt motivates us to act. I hope that you've understood these stories. I hope that you'll find them useful tools, and I hope that you carry them out into the world. Thank you very much.
All right, so now that we've watched that video, we want to separate everyone into some breakout rooms so that we can discuss them. And we do have some guiding questions that we can send in the chat for everyone. Mr. Brown, do you have anything else to add before we separate people?
No, that's perfect, Elizabeth. Excuse me. And along with the questions that we'll post in the chat, just really think about those 3 questions that Dr. Jones posed to all of us at the end of her talk. And let's, I guess, spend 20 to 25 minutes in your groups, and then Elizabeth will bring us all back.
Yes, and I do want to just say, I know sometimes breakout rooms can be intimidating if you don't know the people in them, but we really want to encourage active participation. So if you're able to participate and willing to, share your thoughts on these, that would be great. We really want to encourage everyone to be open, honest, and have a good discussion.
And remember to choose your one person who will report back. Thank you.
Yes. All righty. All right, so I'm going to give everyone a minute or so to come back from breakout rooms, but I know my room had a really great discussion. discussion. So I'm excited to see what other people's thoughts are about everything that, you know, we've seen so far today.
I'm so happy with the turnout. This is great.
I know, I'm so excited. I think I saw some faculty members as well, which is really exciting.
Very good.
All right, it looks like we are almost back to everyone. All righty, take it away.
All righty. Just responding to someone in the chat here. Excellent, you all. So tell me, I guess we had, what do we have, 10 groups?
I think we had more like 15.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah,
this
we
is
had
what
upwards of 15.
well, this is what I want you all to do for the good of the group, because will be running right up on the time. If group number one's person could just give a 1-minute synopsis of what you all talked about, or some takeaways that you may have had. Anybody from group one? And if you forgot to pick somebody, someone can just jump in and do it.
It looks
Okay.
like some people don't remember what
I don't
group
remember what group they were in. All
Since
right.
I randomly assigned people, so they might not have known what.
Okay.
So
All right. Well, how about this? Why don't someone go ahead and jump in and share with us what you all talked about in terms of if you were the scribe for your group.
Yeah, I can start if everyone's okay with that. I feel like my group had a pretty good discussion, and I was with Lindsay, who was talking about how she really liked the analogy with the flowers. And I was telling her that it reminded me of this Monopoly game that I had played in my undergrad, which is like a few years ago, where it was Monopoly, but depending on like we like drew straws or something like that. I can't remember how we did this, but like there was different rules depending on what group you were in. And so some people had rules that were like these rules don't apply to you. So basically like the people with rules that were gave them a huge advantage like did really, really well in the game, and people who had rules that like put them at a big disadvantage really didn't do that well. And it was really interesting to like have a discussion after, just thinking about like, okay, so how does this apply to like real life, and like what are examples of like how this works? And because Monopoly is like making money and having all these things, like it was a very tangible experience. So yeah, I just think it's just an interesting way to like have these discussions and like really make people see like, oh, this is like a big difference. So
Great. Thank you, Cassandra. All right. Who wants to go next?
I can talk a little bit.
All
I
right,
didn't
Zach.
mean to cut you off, Mike. So for the second question, what I was thinking, not experienced directly, but I kind of thought of it as like in high school, we had like private companies in our area. They were SAT tutors or like SAT classes. And some kids who may or may not have been able to afford them were at a disadvantage compared to those who were. And that could be like any number of reasons, but I think of it as like an unequal opportunity for those who are less fortunate. And that kind of resonated with me a little bit when I saw that question specifically.
Okay, very good, Zachary. And that's one of the things that you all focused on in your group?
Yeah, it was one of the things we talked about.
Okay, great. Ben, I see you're ready, but I think Mike was next. Or Mike, did you want to speak?
Sure, I can go. So in our group, one of the things I thought was particularly powerful was that allegory regarding the two-way restaurant sign. As a white male who grew up in upper middle class, suburbia just north of Pittsburgh, it was very almost like a call out, because I think all throughout high school we go through that experience of thinking that racism is just something that you see on the news whenever you live in such a bubble of privilege like that. So that was really a predominant discussion we had, and it was really like an eye-opener, especially when you get to like a college campus, even though we're not perfect here at Pitt still, but it's an eye-opener whenever you have educational resources at your disposal. In addition, one of our members shared a really interesting story about like racism in healthcare. And it was just sort of both ironic, but also like appropriate given the setting, where they were doing an experiential learning opportunity at a Giant Eagle pharmacy, and a patient who was a person of color was coming up to the checkout, and all of the employees were like loathing checking them out. So this individual checked them out, and at first they were wondering, they thought maybe they were just a tough customer, but apparently it was like a language barrier, so that was number one. But it turned out she was the only one who put in the time and had the patience to actually, like speak with them. And it turns out that this individual was actually like a retired doctor, just because they had an accent. So they had that prejudice against them because they were a person of color and of a different culture. But in reality, this person is more educated than virtually anyone in the pharmacy, which is ironic. But I thought those were two really interesting discussions.
Very good, Mike. Yeah, glad that you all surfaced that whole stereotype and bias piece there. Great. Ben Johnson, I think you were next.
Yeah, we just in my group we talked a lot about microaggression, and more so how people in our community, they might look at it as more of like a joke or a lighthearted comment, whereas they don't realize the impact that it has on the person. And so I brought up just examples from middle school and high school where you have kids sort of making jokes or saying like, "Oh, you're the whitest black kid I know," or things like that, where they might think it's funny at the time and it doesn't really affect the person, and yet that leads to a deeper root of self-identity for the person, and trying to figure out where they belong, where they fit. And so yeah, we just talked about that and how we still see it in college and through professors and peers, even though we should be more educated on what that means. So
Very good, very good. And what's interesting is about microaggressions. What's a microaggression to one person might be really a macroaggression or just aggression, period, to another person. So that's very good. Glad you all had that discussion. Who's next? I can't see everybody on my screen either, so just hop in there.
If I can go, my group talked a little bit about privilege and how that word throws people off a lot because, whenever someone thinks of the word privilege, they think of like having a great life, having like, everything you want, like being overly privileged. But when you talk about things like white privilege or male privilege and things like that, it doesn't necessarily mean your life overall has been privileged. It means that aspect of your life has given you some form of privilege compared to like other people. And I think that, when we talk about it, a lot of people get defensive because they're like, I've had a hard life. I've had to work for what I have and stuff. And it's not necessarily that you haven't had a hard life. It's that you have like something about you that makes it a little bit easier. And so we thought that was pretty interesting because so many people kind of don't like to admit when they have privilege because they might have come from like a rougher background or something like that. And so like we were just kind of thinking about other ways to say it without saying privilege because, it turns people away. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Very good, very good. Yes. The whole idea of privilege, right? It kind of puts it can affect all of us in different ways. We do an exercise called the privilege bead exercise, which is really telling because at the end of it, you have this visible representation of either your privilege or your lack thereof. And either way, it usually surprises the person about how much they thought they had, but really don't, or how much they didn't think they have and find out that they do. And so there's this whole idea about earned and unearned privilege. And I agree with you, Elizabeth. The language matters. It really does matter. So we could probably think through that together, you all. All right. Who would like to also share? Or share also? I know we have a few more groups. Adding on to Liz. Okay. Ariana says in the chat, adding on to Liz, I think privilege is related to conversations about equality versus equity in terms of opportunities. Big, important word there, Ariana, absolutely, in terms of opportunities. Even what Dr. Jones shared, part of what she talked about was opportunities, right? And sometimes not addressing need in the face of, or not doing anything in the face of need, we miss opportunities. But there are opportunities some people have, and opportunities that others do not. And that's something that we can definitely look at. Okay. And Alex put something in the chat for us all to look at as well. All right. Anyone else want to share what your group talked about? Don't be shy. There's a bunch of you on here. I know there's a couple more groups. And I would invite the faculty and the staff that sat in groups to also share, if you would like. Your perspective matters too.
And just a reminder also, like, this is a safe space. This is a place for learning and like growth and development. So if you have questions or if you're unsure of something, you can also bring those up too.
Good point, Elizabeth. Thank you. Amanda says in the chat, I also think it takes a lot of intentional reflection to realize this privilege may benefit you. If you have never had to think about it in a negative way affecting you, it's easier to ignore. All I can say to that, Amanda, is amen. So I will even use myself, and then I'm going to, after I share this, I wanted to leave a couple of minutes at the end for Alexa to share something with the group that she wanted to share. But I will use myself as an example here in terms of my male privilege. And being an African-American male, oftentimes I focus on the African-American side, right? I may focus on being a member of a underrepresented group or an even oppressed group, but not recognize my own privilege when it comes to me, my own unearned privilege. I was born a man in America. And I live in a society that has historically valued that gender role above others. And so just by my very being a man or identifying as a man, actually in this society attributes me a certain level of privilege. And I had to wrestle and grapple with that for a while, because I was like, well, it's not like I'm a white guy. Okay, well, that doesn't matter when we're talking about gender roles. So I actually had to really marinate in that for a while and really reflect and see how that shows up. And then after coming to awareness, I then had to be mindful about how I show up into spaces. That's really important as well. So yes, thank you. I believe Amanda brought that up. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Anyone want to share? Does anyone have a story related to any of the three levels of racism and or privilege? Because we're doing a lot of talk about privilege as well, or bias or stereotyping, where either you have witnessed it, perpetuated it, or been a victim of it.
I have this really weird story. I'm Asian American, I speak Chinese, I work in a pharmacy, and we had this one patient who only spoke Chinese come up to us and kind of demand that she pick her medication up. And she called earlier that morning, but wasn't able to effectively communicate with the pharmacist on what medication she actually wanted refilled. So when she came to the pharmacy, she didn't actually have anything to pick up. And then things sort of escalated from there, in which she started like attacking me for being Asian despite being Chinese herself. And it was just like a weird kind of escalation of probably internalized hatred, because she kept on saying things like, you'll never be American if you can speak Chinese. Like, you should be ashamed of being like this kind of Chinese person, and just saying that to me over and over again, which is a very like interesting take, I think. Also, she later said, oh my God, I might be having a heart attack. And so we had to call a code for her. And then they actually came and took her away, and she blamed it on me. But that's a whole different story. But I guess like, probably a little unrelated, but as an Asian American, like, it's weird having both some privilege and some disadvantage. And I think like you mentioning that, like, coming to terms with what privilege you do have and what you don't is a very important topic because I feel like a lot of times, even if you're a minority, you can still perpetrate the system in ways that you don't expect.
Wow, that is some story there, Whitney, and that's beautifully said as well. I mean, I think you just really hit definitely on two of those three levels for sure. And it is amazing how even the internalized racism can then manifest itself in personally mediated racism from people within your own group. It happens every day. Thank you for sharing that very important story. So at this point, I want to say thank you all for letting me be a part of this. I really appreciate it. Um, Probably the most exciting thing I've done today thus far, and probably be the best thing I've done thus far. So I want to turn it over to Alexa, who wants to share something with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Intern Dean Brown. My name's Lex. So I've been doing these forums with Jeremy Huey, who's a P2. We've only had one of them so far. We had one last semester. It was on the bias of professionalism. So professionalism, this concept can be a way to perpetuate racism, sexism, ableism. It can be actually really destructive. And it's something we talk about a lot in pharmacy school professionalism, but we never really acknowledge this dark side to it. So during the forum, it was all students, and we got to have a really open conversation about our experiences with professionalism. Some of the students there shared their experiences, and I think it was really insightful. It's always good to see other people's perspectives. And just as with this event, it's a safe space. There's no judgments. We're all just working to unlearn the racism that's ingrained in us, the biases that are ingrained in us. And in doing that, you're gonna mess up. And it's just important that you show up and you're making that effort. So the next event that we had planned, the next forum, is going to be on white saviorism. So we'll kind of be contrasting that to allyship or accompliceship. Is something you may have heard recently being thrown around. We don't have a date for that yet. Hopefully that forum that I shared with you guys, if we get some responses to that and we see some increased interest in these events, then we'll set a date. It's really difficult with things being virtual, kind of garnering interest and getting people to be engaged. But this is going to be driven by conversation. So we really need that interest, and we need people to show up. But thank you for letting me talk and share that with everybody.
Thank you so much, Lex. I just reposted that link in the chat so that it's more closer to the bottom. So if anyone does want to sign up for the mailing list, this is a great opportunity to do it. Also just wanted to give some wrap up, logistical things. For anyone who is looking for Prime RX credit for this, it will be in the drop down menu. So you do not need a reflective connector. You can just select it from the cultural sensitivity section of Prime RX. We really appreciate everyone who came out, and we're especially thankful to Dean Brown for helping us put this all together, and just being able to teach us so many great things about, anti-racism and opening the floor for a conversation about these topics. If anyone has any questions, you absolutely can feel free to email me. My email, I'll put it in the chat. It's ead85@pitt.edu. If you want any more materials or just want to discuss anything else, feel free. We really thank you all for coming.
And I just want to echo those words on behalf of Kappa Psi and Pitt Pharmacy. I think we can all agree that this was a really informative and well-run event. Huge thanks to Dean Brown and all who helped organize. You guys knocked it out of the park, and I appreciate your time and efforts. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Mike. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day.